2 Kings chapter 8, the Shunammite's land restored. Now Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise and go with your household and stay wherever you can stay, because Adonai has called for famine. Indeed, it has already come on the land for 7 years. So when the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God, she and her household went and stayed in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. Now at the end of the 7 years, the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to the king to appeal for her house and her farm. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God. Please tell me, he was saying, all the great things that Elisha has done. Then it came to pass, just as he was telling the king how he had revived someone who had said, Behold, there was the woman whose son he had revived, appealing to the king for her house and farm. So Gehazi, my lord the king, this is the woman and her son whom Elisha revived. And the king asked the woman, she told him the story. So the king assigned to her a court official, saying, Restore all that was hers and all the revenue of the field since the day she left the land until now. Elisha weeps in Damascus. Then Elisha went to Damascus. All the time King Ben-Hadad of Aram was sick, and he was told, The man of God has come all the way here. So the king said to Hazael, Take offering in your hand and go meet the man of God, and inquire of Adonai by him, saying, Will I recover from this illness? So Hazael went to meet him and took an offering in his hand for every good thing of Damascus, 40 camel loads, and came and stood before him, and said, Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, Will I recover from this illness? Elisha said to him, Go, say to him, You will surely recover. However, Adonai has also shown me that he will surely die. Then he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept. When Hazael said, Why is my lord weeping? He answered, Because I know the evil that you will inflict on the men of Israel. Their strongholds you will set on fire, their young men you will slay with the sword, their little ones you will dash into pieces, and their pregnant ones you will rip open. Then Hazael said, But what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do anything of such magnitude? Elisha answered, Adonai has shown me that you will be king over Aram. Then he departed from Elisha and went to his master, who asked him, What did Elisha say to you? He answered, He told me that you would surely recover. But the next day he took a thick cloth, soaked it in water, and spread it on his face so that he died. Then Hazael became king in his place. Edom revolts against Jehoram. Now in the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat and the king of Judah, Jehoram, the son of King Jehoshaphat of Judah, became king. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. But he walked in the way of the king of Israel, just as the house of Ahab did. For Ahab's daughter was his wife, and he did what was evil in Adonai's eyes. Nevertheless, Adonai was not willing to destroy Judah for the sake of David his servant, since he had promised to give him a lamp for his children all his days. In his days, Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and set up their own king. Then Jordan crossed over to Zair with his chariots. It came about that he rose by night and struck the Edomites who had surrounded him and the chariot commanders, but his troops fled to their tents. So Edom kept rebelling from under the hand of Judah to this day. Then Libnah also revolted at the same time. Now the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? Then Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. Then his son Ahaziah became king in his place. In the 12th year of Joram, son of King Ahab of Israel, Ahaziah, king of Jehoram of Judah, began to reign. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of King Omri of Israel. Now he walked in the way of the house of Ahab, and did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, as the house of Ahab had done, for he was the son-in-law of the house of Ahab. He marched with Joram, sons of Ahab, to war against Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth-Gilead, but the Arameans wounded Joram. So King Joram returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him at Ramah when he fought against King Hazael of Aram. Ahaziah, king of Jehoram of Judah, went down to see Joram, son of Ahab, in Jezreel, because he was sick. 2 Kings chapter 9, Jehu avenges Naboth. Then Elisha the prophet summoned one of the sons of the prophets and told him, Strap up your cloak, take this flask of oil in your hand, and go to Ramoth-Gilead. When you arrive there, look out there for Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi. Then go in, get him to rise up from among his fellows, and bring him to an inner room. Then take the flask of oil and pour it on his head, and say, Thus says Adonai, I have anointed you king over Israel. Then open the door and flee, don't wait around. So the young man, a young prophet, went to Ramoth-Gilead, and when he arrived, behold, the army commanders were sitting. So he said, I have a word for you, commander. Jehu asked, For which one of us? He replied, For you, commander. Then he rose and went inside the house, and the prophet poured the oil on his head, and said to him, Thus says Adonai, God of Israel, I have anointed you king over the people of Adonai over Israel. So you will strike down the house of Ahab your master, that I may avenge the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of Adonai shed by Jezebel. For the whole house of Ahab will perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, slave or free in Israel. I will make the house of Ahab like the house of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, like the house of Baasah, son of Ahijah. The dogs will eat Jezebel in the fields of Jezreel, and there will be none to bury her. Then he opened the door and fled. Then Jehu came to the officers of his master, and one asked him, Is everything all right? Why did this crazy fellow come to you? He said to them, You know the man and his babbling? But they said, It's a lie, tell us now. So he said something like this to me, saying, Thus says Adonai, I have anointed you king over Israel. And they hurried, and every man took his garment and put it under him on the bare steps, and blew the shofar, saying, Jehu is king. So Jehu, son of Jehoshaphat, son of Nimshi, conspired against Joram. Now Joram had been defending Ramoth-Gilead, he and all Israel, against King Hazael of Aram. But King Joram had returned to Jezreel to recover from the wounds that the Arameans had inflicted on him when he fought with King Hazael of Aram. Then Jehu said, If this is your wish, then let no one escape and go out of the city to go tell the news in Jezreel. So Jehu mounted a chariot and went to Jezreel, for Joram was lying there. Meanwhile, King Ahaziah of Judah came down to see Joram. Now the watchman stationed on the tower in Jezreel saw Jehu's troops approaching, and said, I am seeing a troop. Then Joram said, Take a horseman and dispatch him to meet them, and let him ask, Is it peace? So the horse rider went to meet him, and said, Thus says the king, Is it peace? But Jehu said, What do you have to do with peace? Turn behind me. So the watchman reported, saying, The messenger reached them, but didn't come back. Then he dispatched out another horseman, who went to them, and thus says the king, Is it peace? But Jehu answered, What do you have to do with peace? Turn behind me. So the watchman reported, saying, He reached them, but didn't come back, and the driving is like the driving of Jehu, son of Nimshi, for he is driving like a maniac. Then Joram ordered, Hitch up the chariot. So he hitched up his chariot. Then King Joram of Israel and King Ahaziah of Judah went out, each in his chariot, to meet Jehu, and found him at the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. Now when Joram saw Jehu, he asked, Is it peace, Jehu? So he answered, What peace, so long as the harlotries of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? So Joram turned his horses around and fled, crying out to Ahaziah, Treason, Ahaziah! But Jehu drew his bow with his full strength and shot Joram between his arms. And the arrow went out through his heart, and he collapsed in his chariot. Then he said to Bidkar, his side, Pick him up and throw him off the property of the field of Naboth the Jezreelite. Remember how you and I were riding together behind Ahab his father, when Adonai took up the burden against him? As surely as I have seen the blood of Naboth and the blood of his sons yesterday, is it a declaration of Adonai? I will repay you on this property. It is a declaration of Adonai. So now pick him up and throw him onto the property, just as in the word of Adonai. When the king Ahaziah of Judah saw this, he fled by the way of his garden house. But Jehu pursued him and said, Shoot him too. They shot him in the chariot at Gur-Pas near Ibleam. Then he fled to Megiddo, but he died there. Then his servants carried him in a chariot to Jerusalem and buried him in the tomb with his fathers in the city of David. Ahaziah had become king over Judah in the 11th year of Joram the son of Ahab. Now when Jehu arrived at Jezreel, Jezebel heard about it. So she painted her eyes and dressed her hair and looked out the window. As Jehu entered the gate, she said, Is it peace, Zimri, your master's assassin? Then he lifted up his face to the window and called out, Who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs looked down toward him. Then he said, Throw her down. So they threw her down. Then her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and they trampled her. Then he went inside, ate and drank. Then he said, Attend now to this cursed woman and bury her, for she was a king's daughter. But when they went to bury her, they found no more of her than the skull, the feet, and the palms of her hands. So they came back and told him. He said, This is the word of Adonai, which he spoke by his servant Elijah the Tishbite, saying, In the fields of Jezreel, where the dogs eat the flesh of Jezebel, and the carcass of Jezebel will be as dung among the faces of the field and the property of Jezreel, so that they will not say, This was Jezebel. 2 Kings chapter 10. Jehu destroys Ahab's son and Baal worshippers. Now Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. Jehu wrote letters and sent them to Samaria, to the rulers of Jezreel, the elders, and to the guardians of Ahab's son. Now as soon as this letter reaches you, since your master's son are with you, and you also have chariots and horses, a fortified city and weapons, choose the best and most worthy of your master's sons, set him on his father's throne, and fight for your master's house. But they were very terrified and said, Look, 2 kings couldn't stand before him. How then can we? So the steward of the palace, the governor of the city, the elders with the guardians sent word to Jehu, saying, We are your servants, and will do whatever you tell us to. We won't make any man king. Do whatever is good in your eyes. Then he wrote a second letter to them, saying, If you are on my side, and if you will obey me, then bring the heads of the men, your master's sons, and come to me to Jezreel at this time tomorrow. Now the king's sons, 70 people, were with the city's prominent men. When it came to pass that the letter reached them, they took the king's 70 sons and slaughtered them, put their heads in baskets, and sent them to him at Jezreel. When a messenger came and told him, saying, They have brought the heads of the king's sons, he said, Put them in 2 heaps at the entrance of the gate until morning. It came to pass in the morning that he went out and stood and addressed all the people. You are innocent. Behold, I conspired against my master and killed him. But who struck down all these? Now then, that not a word of Adonai will fall to the earth, which Adonai spoke about the house of Ahab. For Adonai has done what he spoke through his servant Elijah. So Jehu struck down all who remained of the house of Ahab in Jezreel, all his nobles, his acquaintances, his priests, until he left him not a survivor. And then he arose and went on his way to Samaria. As he was at shearing house, one of the shepherds along the way, Jehu met with the kinsmen of Ahaziah of Judah, and asked, Who are you? We are the kinsmen of Ahaziah, they replied. We have come down to greet the children of the king and the children of the queen mother. Take them alive, he said. So they took them alive, and struck them down at the pit of the shearing house, 42 men. He spared not a single one of them. Now when he left from there, he met Jehonadab, son of Rechab, coming to meet him. So he greeted him and said to him, Is your heart right as my heart? Is your heart as right as my heart is with your heart? It is, Jehonadab replied. If it is, give me your hand. So he gave him his hand, and Jehu helped him come into the chariot. Then he said, Come with me and see my zeal for Adonai. So he let him ride in his chariot. When he came to Samaria, he struck down all who remained from Ahab in Samaria, until he had destroyed him, according to the word of Adonai spoken to Elijah. Then Jehu gathered all the people together and said to them, Ahab served Baal a little bit, but Jehu will serve him much. Now therefore summon to me all the prophets of Baal, all his worshippers, and all his priests. Let none be missing, for I have a great sacrifice for Baal. Whoever is missing will not live. But Jehu did it in cunning, in order to destroy the worshippers of Baal. Then Jehu said, Sanctify a solemn assembly for Baal. So they proclaimed it. Then Jehu sent throughout Israel, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left who did not come. When they went to the temple of Baal was filled from one end to another. Then he said to the one over the wardrobe, Bring out vestments for all the worshippers of Baal. So he brought out vestments for them, and Jehu and Jehonadab, son of Rechab, went into the temple of Baal, and he said to the worshippers of Baal, Search and look that there is here with you none of the servants of Adonai, only servants of Baal. And they went in to offer sacrifices and burnt offerings. Now Jehu had already stationed 80 of his men outside, and said, If any of the men whom I am bringing into your hands escapes, your life will be for his life. Then it came to pass, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, Jehu said to the guard and to the captains, Go in, strike them down, let none get out. So that they struck them down with the edge of the sword, and the guard and the captains threw them out. Then they proceeded to go into the inner room of the temple of Baal, brought out the pillars of the temple of Baal, and burned them. Then they demolished the pillar of Baal, tore down the temple of Baal, and turned it into latrines, as it is to this day. Then Jehu eradicated Baal from Israel. However, from the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, which he had caused Israel to commit, from these Jehu did not turn away. The golden calves in Bethel and in Dan, now Adonai had said to Jehu, Because you have done well in executing what is right in my eyes, and have done to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart, your sons of the 4th generation will sit on the throne of Israel. Yet Jehu was not careful to walk in the Torah of Adonai, God of Israel, with all his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he caused Israel to commit. In those days Adonai began to reduce the size of Israel. For Hazael defeated them throughout the territory of Israel, from the Jordan eastward in all the land of Gilead, the Gadites, the Reubenites, the Manassites, from Aroer by the Arnon valley up to the Gilead and Bashan. Now the rest of the acts of Jehu and all that he did in his might, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? Then Jehu slept with his fathers, and they buried him in Samaria, and his sons Jehoahaz became king in his place. The day of Jehu's reign over Israel and Samaria was 28 years. 2 Kings chapter 11. A wicked queen Athaliah overthrown. Now when Athaliah, mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal offspring. But Jehasheba, daughter of King Joram and sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were being put to death. She put him and his nurse in the bedroom, so he was hidden from Athaliah, so that he was not killed. He remained with her, hidden in the house of Adonai for 6 years, where Athaliah was reigning over the country. Now in the 7th year, Jehoiada sent and fetched the captains of the hundreds of both the Kerites and the guards, and had them come to him in the house of Adonai. After he cut a covenant with them and put them under an oath in the house of Adonai, he showed them the king's son. Then he commanded them, saying, "This is what you will do. 1/3 of you, those going on duty on Shabbat, keep watch over this palace. Then another third will be stationed at the Sur gate, and the last third will be at the gate behind the guards. So you will keep watch over the house on every side. Your other 2 divisions, who are off duty on Shabbat, will also keep watch over the house of Adonai for the king. So you are to surround the king on every side, every man with his weapons in his hand. Whoever breaks through this ranks must be put to death. You must be with the kings in his comings and goings." So the captains of the hundreds did all that, and Jehoiada and the Kohen commanded. Each of the captains took his men, those who were on duty on Shabbat and those who were off duty on Shabbat, and presented themselves to Jehoiada the Kohen. The Kohen delivered to the captains of hundreds and the spear and the shields that belonged to King David, that were in the house of Adonai. So the guards stood, every man with his weapon in his hand, from the right side of the house to the left side of the house, by the altar and by the house, around the king on every side. Then he brought out the king's son, and put the crown and the insignia on him, and so they proclaimed him king and anointed him. And they clapped their hands and shouted, "Long live the king!" When Athaliah heard the noise and the guards and the people, she came to the people in the house of Adonai. She looked, and behold, the king was standing by the pillar, as was the custom, with the captains and the trumpets beside the king, and all the people of the land rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason!" Then Jehoiada the Kohen ordered the captains of the hundreds appointed over the army, and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks. Whoever follows her, put him to death with the sword. For the Kohen, let her not be put to death in the house of Adonai." So they laid hands on her and brought her to the horses entry of the royal palace, where she was put to death. And Jehoiada cut a covenant between Adonai and the king and the people. They would be Adonai's people, and also between the king and the people. Next, all the people of the land went to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They broke his altars and his images into pieces thoroughly, and slew Matan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. Moreover, the Kohen appointed officers over the house of Adonai. Then he took the captains over hundreds, the Kerites, the guards, and all the people of the land, and they brought the king down from the house of Adonai, and came by the way of the gate of the guards to the royal palace. So he sat on the royal throne. Then all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet. They had already slain Athaliah with the sword in the royal palace.